Figure it out.
Hello, this is Adam Koralik from Figured Out Productions. The following video is a video of some kind, and I hope you enjoy it.
Hey guys, it's Adam here, and today we're going to be talking about this. This is the AVS by Retro USB. Before we start this though, I just want to give a huge shout out to Retro USB. They were cool enough to give me a review unit at the Portland Retro Game Expo. They just handed it to me. I also want to thank John Hancock, the immortal John Hancock, for recommending me to them. That was very nice of him to do. So as a result, we're going to do a video about it. Now, the Retro USB, I'm sure a lot of you guys already know what it is, and if you don't, trust me, we'll get around to it. It's been out for 2 years, so it's not like people have not heard of this thing. But what it is basically a replacement NES. As you can see here, this is an NES, and I would say it's stock, but it's not. This has been RGB modded. It's got the blinking light win in it so that it's the 72-pin drive works. This has been the way I've been playing the NES. I think I even did a video on it a couple of years ago. But I've heard of this thing, and I've wanted it, which is not common for me because I don't typically like aftermarket consoles, but this one's kind of an exception. Now, historically speaking, aftermarket consoles, in my opinion, have been usually pieces of crap. A lot of them are, you know, things like Yobo that are like NOACs. What that is a cheap little box, I'm sure you've seen a million of them out there, where they take like all the processors and everything that's inside of an NES and they just put it down on a single chip, hence the name Nintendo on a chip, or NOAC. And I've always felt that those things have sound problems or video problems. You just kind of get them for the cheap, I just want to play the game experience, but they didn't really do the job very well. And then there was things like the Retron series, which basically at the end of the day, all they are little PCs that specific function is to run an emulator, and they just look in like a retro game shell. That's like their whole point. Some of those, especially the Retron series, were actually done illegally, you know, through emulation. So those are not actually replicating the console, they're just software based essentially. And then you have the higher end ones like the Analog NT, which is basically completely pure Nintendo hardware but modernized. This console is kind of in the middle in that it's not original authentic hardware, but instead it uses an FPGA. So it's not using traditional emulation or traditional NOAC type of technology. It's using an FPGA to essentially replicate the concept of being original hardware. As my buddy Gilly the Kid put it, it's an NES, but it's not, but it is. I don't presume to be able to tell you all the extreme details of how an FPGA works. That's not my wheelhouse. But what I will say is it's pretty solid, and I rather like it. So I know that this thing, like I said, has been out for a couple of years, and there were issues that existed with it originally, as my understanding. This is the later revision model, so certain changes have been made. Very notably, the original, apparently, according to John Hancock, who told me this, the USB port and the HDMI port on the back were kind of a loose connection. Now they're much more solid, and the door here actually is much better as well. So that's good to know. This is the later model. Now, obviously, what this thing is an NES. And that means it can do NES-related things, which, duh. So I wanted to kind of throw everything at it and see what works, what doesn't work, and just kind of give my general thoughts on the final product. Now, as far as compatibility goes, it pretty much runs everything. The primary things that it will not be able to function with are the obvious. Light gun games like Duck Hunt. I mean, the game itself will boot up, but you will not be able to play it because of modern televisions. Now, would it actually work if you were able to connect it to a CRT? I don't know, I don't have the capacity to test that, but something tells me it probably wouldn't. And it's for that same reason you can't use Rob the Robot. But outside of that, you only have minor issues that can be fixed or ignored depending on certain settings. So let's get into that type of stuff. Now, this thing is pretty neat in that right out of the box, it's actually compatible with all three regions. It's region free, so it will play your North American games like Super Mario Bros. 3 that I have here, or Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 3, but it will also play the European games. So this is an exclusive title that only Europe got. Now there's reproductions of it for North America, but this is the original new Ghostbusters 2, not to be confused with Ghostbusters 2, but new Ghostbusters 2, which only got a cartridge release in both Japan and in Europe, but in Europe, of course, they had the NES style casing. And then, of course, it's also capable of playing the Japanese Famicom games. This is a McDonald's game called Donald McDonald Land. He's not called Ronald over there, he's called Donald over there, whatever. But either way, all this stuff works, so that's awesome. Now, the design of the console, pretty simple. It has 4 controller ports on it, which you might question why it needs 4 controller ports. It doesn't need them, they're optional. It has the 2 that you would actually need, and then additional 2 ports for the games that actually did support the multi-tap. This eliminates the need for the need to have that. Back is also very nice. On the back, it's got a simple USB port for power, and it's got an HDMI output. That's all it really needs. It also has this optional port here for Famicom titles. There are certain games that use this for different accessories and that. They built that in so you would have that option. Over here we have the power and reset button. One thing I really like about that is those are actually surplus stock power and reset buttons from an original NES to give it more of that authentic type of vibe. But if you open it up, I mean, it's a simple, matter of just plugging the game in like that. Looks good to have Famicom games in there. And of course, if you take, the North American style cartridge, granted that's the PAL exclusive, it certainly fits in, closes, looks very nice. It is a little tough to get the game out, but you'll be able to do it. They did that to ensure a serious solid connection, because this console does not suffer the flaw that the original NES did, where you had that zero force insertion method where you push it down and then push it down again, and that over time would bend the pins and create a connection that didn't really work. Like that was most of the time where your original NES would stop working. Problems were solved with things like this. This is the blinking light win that's in this one. This one you just go with a straight load and it connects. You replace the board, but that's basically the same type of concept, and it no longer needs to be put down. But much like the blinking light win, really hard to get the cartridge out of there. Okay, there we go. But this one's easier to get the card out, which is nice. Now, it's also compatible with the Famicom Disk System. It will actually fit, though it's not the nicest, most solid connection. It's very obvious they didn't build that with that in mind. It will fit, but the cord back here creates a bit of tension and it kind of keeps it, leaning in an awkward position, which was obviously not really the design. Again, it does technically work, but yeah, that wasn't really the intention, but technically it's compatible. So, it is also compatible with things like the EverDrive. This is the EverDrive N8, both the North American and the Japanese model, both of which do work on there. However, I did notice issues with that initially. So let's go into that. When I first got this thing, it was running an older firmware. And of course, my EverDrives were running an older firmware because to be honest with you, I hadn't touched them in quite some time. And when I would put them into the console, they would boot up to the dashboard, but then they wouldn't go any further than that. If you actually tried to load a game, it would just crash. And I couldn't really figure out what the deal with that was. So I thought, okay, they probably need firmware updates. So I went ahead and updated the retro USB, which I've got to say was very easy. All you do is take your USB cable and plug that into your computer, and then you download the software off of their website, which again is retro USB, as well as the latest firmware. And it's very easy. You just open up the program, it'll say it's got a couple of options on it. It'll detect your console as long as you provide the power, which you have to, of course, turn it on. And then it'll say, like, do you want to upgrade the firmware? You say yes, you find the firmware file, click it, it installs, takes like 90 seconds, and then the console's been updated. So highly recommend you do that. But then even then, I still couldn't get it to work. So then I was like, well, let me check the EverDrives. Realized they were massively out of date. So I went over ahead and updated those, which in the case of the EverDrive is also very easy. Download a little file, throw it onto the SD card, turn on the game, or turn on the cart, it'll self-update, boom, everything worked just fine. So at the end of the day, they work too. The only other compatibility issue I had very briefly was, this didn't even matter because it's not how I would use it, but you guys know I'm very gung-ho on the M cable. I've been talking about it for a while. It's a very fancy HDMI cable. I absolutely love it. Not that I would even recommend using it with this thing because it's designed for later content. I was just curious if it would work. And initially, it didn't. It would display, but the audio was all kinds of screwed up. After I did the firmware update, it worked perfectly fine, no issues whatsoever. Again, not even what I would actually use to play it with, I just wanted to see if it worked. And it does now that it's been firmware updated. So, with all that kind of stuff out of the way, what's the actual console experience like? Well, very simple to plug in and play, as I mentioned before. Once you do that, you'll turn it on, you'll have multiple different options. By default, the first thing that comes up is to actually start whatever cartridge it detects inside there. So skipping that one for now, what you can do is go to Online Scoreboard. Now this feature, I didn't really make any real use out of, but it's a great way to keep track of scores and do other online related things. You'd have to tinker with that. That wasn't really my wheelhouse. wheelhouse. I believe it requires also connecting it to a PC and to use that. So moving on, the next thing over is video settings. Now here's a whole host of different options and things. I have it set here kind of the way I like it. I feel like the NES looks at its best when the correct aspect ratio is observed. So I use the horizontal horizon. I adjusted that 3 over from the left. The vertical I adjusted, I think 3 as well. Basically frame it to your personal preference on your television or monitor, but I'm sure you'll get it all figured out. There's also things like color palette in there you can mess around with, again, if it's up to date. There's also things like extra sprites. This is kind of an interesting feature because the NES originally, you would notice if there were too many characters on a screen, it would flicker. They have a setting in here to disable that and change that. Which was cool, but what that can do, while it make the gaming experience more solid, it can introduce errors that didn't exist there originally, so just be aware of that possibility. There's also this thing where the NES had the option to cut off part of the screen. Now it did that because originally the NES didn't intend for you to see the stuff on the left of the screen, but the AVS gives you the option to see it. So you have more information, but it's a little wonky, so it's up to you to turn it on or off. Again, boils down to personal preference. And then there's a couple other, just adjustments to the modes in there. There's things like scan lines and all that stuff, which I personally don't use, but a lot of that stuff is really just kind of up to you. There's also NTSC and PAL, depending on what region you're in. Next over from that is control settings. Here's some options about how to access cheat menus and to do other stuff and turbo options. The other one that's in there that's rather interesting is the option to actually disable the dashboard or re-enable it. Personally, I leave it on, but what that essentially means is if you turn it off, then whenever you put a cartridge in and just turn it on, it'll go straight to the game, much like the original NES. It won't actually go to the dashboard anymore. I'd rather have it go to the dashboard personally, but that's me. That's up to you. Then they have Game Genie. This is actually the big reason why I would want it to go to the dashboard every single time, is if you it has Game Genie built into it along with a whole host of codes. In fact, if you have a legitimate cartridge in there and it has that game in its database, it will actually give you a whole bunch of recommendations of different game code options. So if you had Super Mario Bros. 3 in there, much like I do, it'll detect the game, you pick the codes you want, start up the game, and boom, there you are. So now that we're taking a look at Super Mario Bros. 3, looks pretty amazing, doesn't it? This is what the games run like and look like on the AVS. And I gotta say, I think it's a really solid experience. And I'm gonna give you guys some comparison here. So next up, this is the same exact game, but this is running on the RGB NES that you see on my table. Now keep in mind, this is not an HDMI NES. This is an RGB NES running through a FrameMeister. Looks amazing. I gave it to the AVS. I think it looks better. And just for the hell of it, I thought we'd compare it to this. This is an S-Video modded NES, which is, there's no real reason to include this because almost nobody bothered modding the NES for S-Video, but hey, technically it's there, it's what it can look like. And then if we go down to what most people were using, this is composite through the NES. This is how most people have played the NES throughout the years. This is what it typically looks like. Now again, if you went from the stock NES to the AVS, here's the jump. Yeah, that's a pretty big deal, isn't it? And it's solid, man. It looks really, really good. Natively, it outputs in 720p, and it's incredibly vibrant and incredibly colorful. Now, one must understand that the NES is a little different from other retro consoles in that it doesn't have a native RGB palette. People have kind of had to invent one, so that's why actually earlier on there's a whole different host of color palette options. They're kind of fine-tuned for your personal preferences. I know there's other palettes out there that people want added retroactively, which could be done through firmware. We'll see if that happens in time. But personally, I stick with the original color palette, at least for now. But yeah, it's pretty solid, and I'm really, really enjoying this particular machine. I mean, just look at some more footage here. Like here's some footage of Ghostbusters 2. Again, this game is pretty solid if you liked Ghostbusters stuff. I know by this point a lot of people know about it, but it's a pretty cool game, and there are actually repros of it now if you want it for your North American library. As far as Ghostbusters games go, which usually weren't very good to begin with. And then I also decided to throw in Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 3, just because this game is incredibly colorful and you could really see how much it actually looks like. And then I also again wanted to show you some Japanese gameplay. So this is Donald McDonald Land, which is a cool game that I'm not really sure why they never brought over here, because the entire game is fully in English. Like, they did all the work, like it's all there. If I was just playing like a ROM dump of it or something, I wouldn't know that this hadn't come out here, you know what I mean? It's very, very solid. Now, is it actually that great of a game? No, but would it have fit in the NES library? story? Oh, hell yeah. So, yeah, I think that's kind of about all I have to say with it. I really enjoy it. I'll put a link in the description if you want to check out Retro USB and you want to pick one up. Retails for about 180 bucks, so it's more expensive than the kind of crappier clone consoles, but it does the job substantially better. Now, it's not the Analog NT, but that thing's also about twice the price of this thing. So, you know, boils down to your personal preference. But I gotta say, man, this is how I'm going to be playing the NES now. As much as I love my Blinking Light Win NES with its RGB mod, freeing up a slot in my RGB setup will be nice to be able to put something else in there that uses RGB SCART, maybe something like the Neo Geo or whatever. Replacing it will be good. And because HDMI, it's more prevalent, I have way more switch boxes that can support it and all that stuff. So getting it into the infrastructure will be great. Plus, to be honest, it just, in my opinion, just looks better. Now, you maybe purists, more purists will disagree. It's up to you. But at the end of the day, I personally like this machine a lot, and I'm very happy to have it. So again, thank you to Retro USB. I want to thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you all later.